All right, guys. So this is probably going to be my last time responding to this guy. Uh, I just came across this second video he had responding to an objection one of his commenters left. So I'm just going to address this last video, and I'm just gonna call the logic or problem of evil like end it from here on, at least from his side, because I can't keep responding to these. But you can basically just check out the entire premise of my arguments from my previous video, my objection, and it's perfectly fine. But I just want to address this last thing he said, and we'll move on from this topic.
Here left a pretty interesting comment. He says that God created all of us to be self-sufficient because we are complex and intelligent beings. He also goes on to say that if God were to step in and fix every little thing, human beings would become complacent and rely on him to fix everything. But while it is true that majority of the population will grow up to be capable of some sort of self-sufficiency, where does that leave the rest of the population? Kids and some elderly require external assistance to get by day to day, in the same way people with disabilities need a caregiver. Now, I wouldn't go so far as to say that they are fully codependent, but admittedly, they are less self-sufficient than the majority of us. And without external help, they are inherently going to encounter more unnecessary suffering than the average person. And perhaps my examples in the first video weren't exactly clear, because my point was, what happens when the external help, meaning help from other humans, isn't administered, not out of complacency or negligence, but of sheer circumstance? Amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, otherwise known as ALS, is a disease that progressively destroys a person's motor neurons. And what this means is while their cognition and sensation remain largely intact, they start to feel weak. They lose the ability to speak, to breathe, and eventually become paralyzed. Half of these patients die within the first 3 months, and 90% of them die within the first 5 years. Now, the people around them can pour every bit of care and money into getting them treatment, but the best modern medicine can do right now is to prolong the inevitable. This is not an isolated experience. Current research estimates that up to 400,000 people can be suffering from ALS at any given time. And ALS is just one example. Cancer, stroke, dementia are all diseases with absurdly high mortality rates. But who could stop that other than an all-powerful, all-seeing, morally perfect God? It just seems entirely contradictory that a being like that could exist and allow that to happen. Now, like I said in my original video, I'm not here to discuss specific instances where I find contradictions in the Bible or the Quran, but if you are basing your entire worldview off of something, you would hope that your subject of worship at least follows some sort of logic. I think that faith is a very convenient thing that people use to stop thinking for themselves and to stop questioning things in general. But listen, I always say this, if your belief falls apart at any form of skepticism and probing, then maybe it wasn't that strong to begin with.
Right. So the last part he said there is really interesting. He said if your belief falls apart because of skepticism, and then he starts talking about faith, right? But the funny thing is that faith is itself a suspension of judgment and an appeal to a sort of ignorance. That's true. That much is true about faith, but so is skepticism. So is being an agnostic, and you suspend judgment on the matter, and you just think, oh, I can't really decide between these two options. That's also a suspension of judgment as much as faith is. So they share this identical property that I feel like the other side isn't as willing to engage with, right? Because they simply give negative claims for, they don't even give negative claims, right? They don't even adopt a burden of proof to substantiate a negative claim as to why they think God doesn't exist. Instead, what they're doing is they're saying, I'm not convinced because of reason A, B, C, D, E, F. Right? But that's not, they don't really show, they don't really provide evidence for those propositions. Like, to begin, in this video earlier on, he talked about
Humans is
unnecessary suffering. Okay? And then he doesn't provide any evidence for his proposition as to why this suffering is unnecessary, or how he's measuring that degree of necessity. Is he doing it through like a mental apparatus? Is he doing it through like uh because he's presupposing some sixth sense that people have for this qualitative qualitative uh qualitative subject of necessity, that there's a method in which you can measure it through a priori reason. So that I see a lot of metaphysical commitments that he's like bringing to the table, but he's not really like explicitly acknowledging them. And also earlier on, he addressed Gavin's point. I think Gavin raised one part of greater good theodicy, which was self-sufficiency, right? And I believe to steal man Gavin's comment about self-sufficiency, it's not so much that the act is self-sufficient, but more like the focus should be more on, oh, then that generates like an infinite amount of goodness because you're putting in effort to uh, be independent, to be able to depend on yourself, and that's a good thing, right? That's goodness. To develop the hard work and sheer indignation, to thrive by yourself without depending on others. That's a property of goodness. So that should work in favor of God, right? And this guy, points to an instance of whereby you cannot have self-sufficiency. Okay, fine. You can't have self-sufficiency. But again, is that suffering unnecessary? Right? Is that suffering unnecessary? I'm going to list an objection as to why I don't think that suffering is unnecessary. In fact, I think it's necessary in order for goodness to be maximized, right? Because if you have an instance where people lack self-sufficiency, then you also have other people like your doctors, your uh, passerbys, your family, who come together and help you through this difficult medical ailment or condition or like traumatic experience you have. And you're not at all self-sufficient. But these people doing deliberate acts of kindness, deliberate acts of goodness, generate goodness that is like infinitely more good than if you will have to have a world full of philosophical zombies and people simply just didn't have to go out their way and do deliberate acts of goodness that generated in all these all this more greater goodness, then that world would have less good in it than this world where people actually have to go out of their way, take deliberate action to generate even more greater goodness, right? These infinite acts of goodness. Because they're not obliged to from the time when they were cavemen and developed into modern day civilization. They weren't like explicitly guided all the way through like toddlers, right? Maybe Adam and Eve were in the Bible, but that's in the realm of allegory and also allegorical elements as well as some real narrative elements and maybe maybe truth insofar as there really are humans really do exist. S- But at the end of the day, like the objections he's pushing forward do not survive the test of scrutiny, right? He doesn't tell us why it's unnecessary. And I think I will give him the benefit of the doubt because he's convinced by his skepticism. I don't think his skepticism is convincing as for reasons as I have shown today. But I'm gonna leave it at this, right? I'm gonna leave it at this. This is probably going to be uh, probably going to be a while before you hear from me again on this topic, or maybe not. But yeah, that's all I have to say, guys. Peace.